I never imagined the end of my marriage would arrive with the sharp slap of papers hitting my lap, tossed across a crowded restaurant as if they were nothing. One moment I was lifting my water glass, and the next, my husband stood over me with that smug posture he used whenever he needed an audience. And of course, he had one. Half the waitstaff paused mid-step, forks hovered above plates, voices fading into stunned silence. The warm scent of garlic and baked bread hung in the air, strangely at odds with the cold spectacle unfolding before them. "This is the only thing you've contributed to my life lately," he announced loudly, making sure his new girlfriend heard every word. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs slowly, her phone angled upward as she recorded me like some spectacle. I caught the faint light on her screen, the half smile curling on her lips as if she'd been waiting for this performance all week, delighted to claim her role in his little show. He didn't even bother to sit. "You've been dragging me down," he continued, holding me back. "But don't worry, I'm upgrading." He nodded toward her like she was a prize he'd won. She gave a tiny wave, her bracelets chiming as if applauding him. People stared at me with that mixture of pity and curiosity. Some waited for me to cry, others waited for me to scream. I did neither. I simply looked at the papers, thick white pages covered in the legal language he assumed would shatter me. A waiter lingered behind me, pretending to wipe a table, but really listening. Inside, something tightened, then loosened. I thought of all the ways I supported him, how I edited his resumes, scheduled his appointments, and quietly covered the rent when he claimed he was between opportunities. He never once asked how I kept us afloat. He never cared. And now here he was, parading his cruelty as if it made him powerful. The girlfriend whispered something about me finally knowing my place. The words drifted across the table. I set my glass down. My hands looked calm despite the storm beneath my skin. But what neither of them understood, what no one in that restaurant could guess, was that I was not the one losing anything today. Their little performance could not reach the parts of my life they knew nothing about. The parts I kept deliberately hidden from a man who never bothered to look deeper. "Are you going to say anything?" he asked when I didn't react. He wanted drama. He wanted confirmation that he mattered enough to break me. His girlfriend zoomed her camera, eager to catch the ruin she expected. I looked up at him slowly. He seemed smaller than before, though he puffed his chest out as if expecting applause. Instead, I picked up the papers, holding them the way someone might hold a receipt for something they never bought. His eyes flickered with a hint of confusion. I could tell he expected a scene, the meltdown that would make his girlfriend grin and whisper that he made the right choice. I stood, not quickly, just long enough for the room to grow quiet again. Chairs creaked. Someone exhaled. "If this is what you want," I said softly, "then that's what you'll have." The girlfriend scoffed. "That's it? You don't even care?" I turned to her. "You just seem to have everything figured out," I replied. "Enjoy it while it lasts." Her smile wavered. My husband waved dismissively. "She'll be fine," he said to her. "She's got nothing left to lose." Nothing left to lose? The irony nearly made me laugh. I gathered my bag, folded the papers neatly, and walked past them. I didn't rush. They believed my silence meant defeat, that the calm in my step was resignation. As I moved toward the door, I felt dozens of eyes following me, unsure whether they had witnessed a tragedy or the quiet beginning of something else. I didn't bother to hide the small exhale that escaped me, a release, not of sorrow, but of relief. They thought they had written my ending. They had no idea it was only the prologue. Everything about the moment felt strangely calm and sharply defined. But if only they knew where I was headed after this. People often assume that when a marriage ends this badly, it must have been doomed from the start. But that's the thing, ours wasn't. In the beginning, there was softness. I remember Sundays that smelled like pancakes and sunlight, evenings spent laughing over nothing, mornings when he kissed my forehead like he couldn't imagine a world without me. Back then, he held my hand with both of his, grateful, not greedy. He used to tell me he couldn't believe someone like me even noticed someone like him. I always thought that was humility. I didn't realize it was the seed of a deeper insecurity waiting for oxygen. Those were the days when he'd come home exhausted from another job interview that led nowhere, dropping his bag on the floor with a sigh heavy enough to bend the walls. He tried, I'll give him that, but trying didn't pay bills. Not then, not ever. So I did what I was taught. I stepped in, quietly, gracefully, without keeping score. I covered rent when he was between opportunities. I paid utilities, so the lights never flickered when he wanted to stay up late researching a new career path. I handled groceries, car repairs, insurance renewals, every background task that keeps a life running. He thanked me at first, almost embarrassed, and I never once mentioned where the money came from. My family's wealth, layered, and discreet was something I learned early to tuck away like fine jewelry. Present, valuable, but not for everyday display. I grew up around estates older than our city, surrounded by people who could trace their lineage through portraits hung in long hallways. But I hated the idea of using any of that to hold power over him. I wanted our relationship to feel fair, balanced, chosen, not bought. So when we moved in together, I let him believe my income came from freelance projects and steady part-time work. In truth, I had been quietly building a business that took off faster than I allowed anyone to see. I poured my energy into it at night, while he slept on the couch with job listings glowing on his laptop. I chose not to tell him that I'd already achieved more than either of us expected. Not because I wanted a secret, but because I didn't want him to feel small. But insecurity has a way of expanding even in silence. When he finally landed a good job, his first real stepping stone, something shifted. Suddenly he walked differently, spoke differently, smiled like a man who wanted the world to see him shine. And I encouraged it. I wanted him to feel proud. I thought this new confidence would strengthen our marriage. Instead, it built the first crack. The more he succeeded, the more he needed people to watch him succeed. Compliments became fuel. Validation became oxygen. And somewhere in the middle of office mixers and networking events, he started meeting people who fed his ego more aggressively than I ever could. Men who bragged about upgrading their lives, who mocked partners who supported them too much. Women who giggle at married men and called it harmless. The girlfriend, his new prize, was among them. She slid into his world with her curated laughs, dramatic lashes, and the effortless ability to make him feel like the center of every room. I noticed the shift before he did, the subtle changes, the new haircut he didn't ask my opinion about, the cologne he bought because everyone at work wears something stronger, the phone turned face down during dinner, the messages answered in the bathroom. Then came the criticism, tiny jabs wrapped in jokes. Why was I always working? Why didn't I praise him more? Why did I seem so calm when he talked about his successes? Calm, that was the word he used. As though steadiness were a flaw. As though my quiet nature somehow dulled his shine. I didn't argue. I kept supporting him financially even when he didn't realize it. I kept growing my business in the background while his world grew louder, fleshier. The more he climbed, the more he resented that I didn't need climbing at all. And instead of telling him that my family's wealth could have erased every anxiety he ever had, I stayed silent because I wanted him to feel secure on his own foundation. But some men don't want partners. They want mirrors. And when the wrong people started flattering him, he finally found someone who reflected the version of himself he liked best. She didn't know his flaws. She didn't know his debts. She didn't know his late-night fears. She didn't know the real him. And by then, he didn't want the real me. I met her long before the restaurant incident at a charity gala I had quietly funded for years. She arrived wearing confidence like perfume, thick and suffocating, clinging to every surface she touched. I remember watching her step out of the town car he insisted on renting. Even though I'd offered my own, she slid her arm through his like she'd been practicing in the mirror, already posing for a life she hadn't earned. And the second her eyes landed on me, something sharp flashed behind them: recognition, envy, ambition, the dangerous kind. She didn't greet me. She assessed me. Her smile was polished, but her tone carried the kind of entitlement usually inherited, not manufactured. "Could you take my shawl?" she asked, lifting it toward me like I was staff. She didn't even wait for my response, she simply assumed. My husband stood there, staring at me as if this were somehow amusing, like he was waiting to see whether I'd play along with her fantasy. I didn't take the shawl. I just looked at him, searching for the man who used to pull out my chair, who used to shield me from embarrassment rather than entertainment. He shrugged and said nothing, absolutely nothing. That silence told me more than any confession ever could. She looped her arm tight around his and whispered something loud enough for me to hear. Some people cling because they're scared to evolve. I felt the comment hit me like a pinprick. Small but intentional, a test. She wanted to see how far she could push. Inside the gala, she floated around like the room had been built for her, greeting people she didn't know with a confidence she didn't deserve. And every few minutes, she glanced back at me, checking if I was watching. I wasn't, not really. I was studying him, watching how he puffed his chest when she bragged about his potential, how he beamed when she told strangers that he was meant for bigger things, as if I had held him small. It became obvious she'd heard stories he crafted, stories where I was the obstacle and he was the phoenix waiting to rise once freed from me. It was almost laughable watching her parade around like she'd stolen something valuable instead of something already crumbling. At one point, she cornered me by the silent auction table. Her voice dropped to a rehearsed softness, the kind used by women who mistake condescension for compassion. "He just outgrew the phase you represent," she said, fingers brushing a diamond bracelet she definitely couldn't afford. "You should let him go so he can grow. Let him go. Not for his happiness, for his growth." As if he were some prize she'd polished and improved simply by desiring him. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I didn't explain that the event she was bragging about attending had been funded in part by my family for generations, or that the silent auction items she was admiring came from donors who sent me handwritten thank you cards every year. I didn't mention that the estate hosting the after party belonged to one of my closest childhood friends. She thought she was stepping into my world. She didn't realize she was merely trespassing. I excused myself and walked to the balcony, letting the cool air settle the rising heat in my chest. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was disappointed, deeply, profoundly disappointed. Not in her, in him, in the man who once prayed for my support and now pretended he never needed it. That night, when we got home, he bragged about how she handled herself. I simply nodded, went to my office, and sent a message to my lawyer. The subject line was only 3 words: "We need to talk." When I walked into my attorney's office that morning, the air felt different still, deliberate, almost reverent. My lawyer, Martin, had represented my family for decades, long before my husband ever appeared in my life. He knew every estate clause, every generational protection, every legal thread woven into the wealth my relatives treated more like legacy than luxury. And the moment I sat down across from him, he offered a sympathetic look that told me he already suspected why I was there. I slid the divorce papers across the table, the same ones my husband had thrown at me like confetti at a celebration. Martin didn't even open them at first. Instead, he asked softly, "Has he finally shown his hand?" I nodded. "With an audience?" Only then did he read them, flipping through the pages with the kind of careful precision that contrasted so sharply with the way my husband had tossed them at me. After several minutes, he set them aside and pulled out a different folder, thick, worn from years of safekeeping. Our prenup. He placed it in front of me like a reminder of my own foresight, even though I'd been too in love at the time to appreciate why everyone insisted it mattered. I remembered the way my husband groaned about it back then, complaining about pointless legal paranoia, insisting he didn't need to read it because we were a team. I remembered his dismissiveness, how he skimmed the signature page like it was a simple delivery receipt. He never asked what it contained, and I hadn't pressed him. Martin opened to the first tab. "You do understand," he said, adjusting his glasses. that he's entitled to nothing. Hearing it said aloud was like letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. No marital assets, I asked, though I already knew the answer. None, he confirmed. Your business, your accounts, the properties in your name, everything is protected under the Bennett Estate Trust. The prenup simply adds a second well around it. And because he never contributed financially, because he never invested, because he was never added to any deed, he walks away with only what he brought into the marriage, which was nothing, truly nothing. He had entered my life with ambition and potential, but no assets. I'd helped him through layoffs, student debt, messy career restarts, all of it. And now the woman he left me for had convinced him he'd cash out by untethering himself from me. Martin flipped to the final clause, one my grandmother personally insisted on. Clause 17, he said, tapping the paragraph. If he initiates the divorce, he forfeits even spousal support. I let out a slow, steady exhale. The irony almost felt theatrical. So he'll walk into court expecting a payout, I murmured, and leave with nothing but his pride. Martin gave a subtle smile. If he has any left. For a moment, I let myself imagine him standing there, puffed up confidence melting into panic as reality hit. But I pushed that fantasy aside. Revenge wasn't the goal. Clarity was. Freedom was. Dignity was. Still, I couldn't deny the emerging sense of poetic symmetry. What do you want me to do next? Martin asked. Nothing, I said. Not a word. No contact. No updates. No hints. His brows lifted. You want silence. I want him comfortable, I clarified. Complacent. Let him think he's winning. Let him plan his victory speech. His new life. His little upgrade. The bitterness crackled through my tone before I softened it. The less he suspects, the cleaner this will go. Martin closed the folder carefully. We can file whenever you're ready. Your timeline is your power in this. He already made the first move publicly. Now you decide how it ends privately. I sat back, absorbing that truth. My husband loved spectacle. He loved the performance of success more than success itself. He loved the validation, the applause, the spotlight, anything that made him feel larger than life. He didn't care what was real as long as people believed the illusion, and that was his weakness, because the real decisions weren't made on stages or in restaurants or in front of a smirking girlfriend with a phone camera. They were made quietly in rooms like this one, surrounded by documents he never bothered to read, protected by legacies he never respected. I took the prenup copy Martin handed me and slipped it into my bag. Not as a weapon, as a reminder that I wasn't the powerless, abandoned woman he wanted to make me feel like. I had built my own business, supported him without boasting, protected my family's estate without flaunting it, and while he was busy chasing applause, I had been building a safety net he never realized he wasn't included in. As I stood to leave, Martin asked one final question. Do you want him to know anything? I shook my head slowly. No, let him celebrate. Let him show off. Let him believe he's already won. I opened the door, feeling a calmness settle over me like armor. Let him plan his victory tour, I said. I'll prepare the real finale. The first sign that he'd started his little parade came 2 days after he threw the divorce papers at me. My phone buzzed nonstop. Not from people checking on me, but from screenshots, posts, stories, comments circulating like wildfire. He had changed his relationship status, not to single, but to a curated collage of himself and her in matching outfits, grinning in the front seat of a car he absolutely could not afford. He captioned it, "Sometimes you outgrow people, sometimes you upgrade." A not-so-subtle jab, crafted for maximum public sting. She reposted it with heart emojis and a video of them clinking glasses in a rooftop bar, announcing that he was finally living his truth. They posed like a couple celebrating an engagement, not a man walking away from a marriage he hadn't even properly mourned. It was astonishing how quickly he pivoted from husband to showman, performing happiness like it was a role he'd been rehearsing behind my back for months. My friends called immediately, half in disbelief, half in anger, asking if I wanted anything taken down, if I wanted them to respond, if I wanted to set the record straight. But I told them no. Silence is a power most people underestimate. His entire world revolved around attention. Denying him a reaction was its own quiet form of control. Meanwhile, the comments rolled in like cold rain. So he finally left her. I knew she was dragging him down. He looks so happy now. She wasn't the right fit for his lifestyle. This new girl matches him better. Some people even tagged me directly, offering unsolicited sympathy that wasn't sympathy at all. You'll find someone eventually, they wrote, as if I were a discarded shirt someone forgot to pick up. Others went crueler. She wasn't enough for him. No wonder he left. She looks older than him. Strangers crafted stories about my worth based on the curated fantasy he paraded online. And still, I said nothing. It wasn't easy. I won't pretend it was. There were nights when I lay awake replaying the humiliation, hearing the laughter in that restaurant, seeing her smirk, feeling the sting of papers hitting the table like a slap. I wondered if keeping quiet made me look weak. I wondered if everyone believed the narrative he crafted. I wondered if silence was really strength or just a shield to hide behind while my heart pieced itself back together. But every time doubt whispered in my ear, I reminded myself, truth doesn't rush, justice doesn't shout, and dignity rarely performs for an audience. So while he uploaded photos of champagne bottles and dance floors, while he flaunted the rental car as if it were a permanent trophy, while he smiled for cameras he was secretly terrified would stop pointing at him, I kept my head down and moved deliberately. I met with my attorney. I reviewed documents. I visited the estate my grandmother left me, walking through its quiet halls like someone remembering who she truly was before life got noisy. What people didn't know was that behind my calm exterior, there was heartbreak, but not the kind people assumed. I didn't grieve losing him. I grieved losing the version of myself who believed he truly loved me. I mourned the woman who worked 3 jobs in the early years of our marriage so he wouldn't drown under his own failures. I mourned the naive faith I gave him freely, the belief that loyalty would be returned because I offered it unconditionally. But every wave of sadness was followed by a stronger wave of clarity. Every bruise on my pride hardened into resolve. Every cruel comment turned into quiet fuel. The world thought he was ascending, but I knew better. He was spending money he didn't have, burning bridges he still needed, running a marathon powered only by ego and denial. Meanwhile, I was rebuilding not loudly, not publicly, but deeply. Each day I felt myself becoming someone steadier, smarter, more deliberate. My silence wasn't absence, it was preparation. Let them think I was broken. Let them believe he'd won. Let them cheer his victory tour like it was the climax of his success story. Because while he celebrated under neon lights and borrowed luxury, I was reclaiming something far more powerful than anyone realized. And soon enough, they would all see exactly where the real ascent was happening. The drive to the estate always felt like stepping into a different lifetime. The world shifted mile by mile, traffic thinning, streets widening, noise dissolving into soft countryside air. Most people didn't know this place existed, and that was by design. My family kept it off every searchable record, buried under layers of trusts and generational protections that made it almost invisible. Even my husband, the man who shared my home and my bed for years, never realized he'd married someone who didn't just come from money, but came from legacy. When the main iron gate swung open, the first thing I saw was the long tree-lined path, branches arching overhead like a cathedral of green. Sunlight flickered between the leaves, and for the first time in weeks, I felt my lungs expand all the way. I parked near the front courtyard, where the old stone fountain still trickled the same quiet song it had since I was a child. The estate stretched behind its acres of vineyards rolling in perfect symmetry, a deep sapphire lake catching the sky's reflection, guest houses tucked like secrets among the trees, and the main house towering with its windows glowing softly under the morning sun. This wasn't a mansion, it was a world. I stepped out of the car, my heels crunching on gravel, and one of the groundskeepers, Mateo, spotted me first. He broke into a warm smile. "Welcome home," he said, the same way he used when my parents were alive. Home. The word hit something tender in me. Inside. The house smelled faintly of cedar and old books, polished floors, and fresh lilies. Someone always kept fresh flowers in the entryway even though I visited only a few times a year. The staff respected the privacy of the place, tending to it like a living memory. They never asked about my husband. They never commented on my absence. They simply greeted me with warmth that didn't demand explanations. I wandered through the hallways slowly, almost reverently. Portraits of past generations lined the walls. Stoic faces, soft eyes, familiar features. My grandmother's portrait hung at the end of the main hall, her expression poised and knowing. She had always insisted I learn independence early, how to manage accounts, how to understand trusts, how to handle assets without flaunting them. Wealth is not meant to be paraded, she used to say. It's meant to be protected and quietly sustained by those who respect its weight. My husband never understood that kind of philosophy. He liked loud things, visible success, flashy objects that created the illusion of prosperity. True wealth, the kind that didn't need to be performed, was foreign to him because it didn't boost his ego, and because he never bothered to read the prenup or ask about my background. He assumed that our modest city home and my unbranded lifestyle meant I had nothing more. Let him keep assuming. I made my way toward the gallery wing, one of my favorite places in the estate. Every generation curated their own collection, adding pieces that reflected their life's chapter. My grandmother favored quiet watercolor landscapes. My father collected modern sculpture. My mother, who loved stories more than art, displayed letters and journals from her ancestors. I had never added anything of my own yet. I always thought I would someday, but life with him always felt too loud, too chaotic, too filled with emotional clutter to leave room for legacy. That thought stung. But as I walked past the canvases, I felt something in me settle. I wasn't the woman he tried to paint online, a pitiful, abandoned ex-wife he had outgrown. I wasn't someone who'd been humiliated into silence. I wasn't the one struggling, or scrambling, or begging for dignity. I was standing in a home that had existed before he was even born, one he had never laid eyes on, one he could never claim even a single brick of. My silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. I stepped outside onto the balcony overlooking the vineyards. A soft breeze carried the scent of grapes and sun-warmed earth. Workers moved between the rows, their steady rhythm grounding and comforting. Beyond the vineyard, I could see the lake shimmering, the boathouse nestled against its shore. Childhood memories rushed back, learning to row, summer picnics, midnight swims under the stars. This estate had shaped me long before heartbreak ever touched my life. Being here reminded me that I wasn't lost. I'd simply been out of alignment. I walked down to the lake, letting my fingers skim the water. It was cool, smooth, calming. Somewhere behind me, birds sang in the trees, and for a moment, everything felt whole. Not perfect, not healed, but whole in a way heartbreak couldn't corrupt. This was power reversal number one. Not because I had wealth. Wealth means nothing without peace, but because I remembered who I was before he dimmed the lights around me. He spent his days posting photos, bragging, pretending he had traded up. He wanted the world to see me as fragile, devastated, discarded, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. My strength wasn't loud. It didn't need crowds or cameras. It didn't crave applause. It grew in quiet places like this, in legacy, in history, in stillness. And as I looked across the estate, the vineyards, the lake, the guest houses, the gallery, the life he never even imagined, I felt something shift deeply inside me. They thought they had embarrassed me. They had no idea what I was standing on. The knock came in the middle of a quiet afternoon, a sharp sound that made my cat dart under the sofa. I opened the door to find him standing there, tall and smug, his new girlfriend practically leaning on his arm like she owned the hallway. Their expressions were carefully rehearsed, patronizing, superior, full of that self-satisfied energy people project when they think they've won. He held a small envelope and a manila folder. "I just left some documents for you," he said, voice casual, as if dropping papers into my life were an act of kindness. His girlfriend smirked behind him, eyeing my modest apartment as though it were an exhibit in a museum of failure. "You still living here?" she asked, loud enough for the neighbors to overhear. Her tone carried that fake concern that veils mockery. "I mean, maybe you could rent a room somewhere, you know?" She laughed at her own quip. Like I should be grateful she gave me such advice. I let it hang in the air. I didn't correct her. I didn't react. Silence was my armor. I invited them in, even offered tea. I watched them glance around at the small space, noticing nothing more than the furniture we'd picked together years ago when it suited his tastes. They assumed I had no other options, no hidden world, no untouchable foundation beneath my feet. They assumed I was desperate, scrambling, lost. I let them believe every lie their eyes were telling them. Let them feel victorious for a few hours. It made the eventual reality all the sweeter. While I poured the tea, he began bragging about the renovations he'd done on his new apartment, the new car he leased, the restaurants he and his girlfriend frequented. I nodded, sipped my tea, smiled faintly when he looked at me for validation. Every boast reinforced the illusion I let them hold. I didn't need to speak to claim my power. The quiet, invisible strength settled between us like a weight they couldn't lift, though they believed the balance had shifted entirely in their favor. His girlfriend leaned against the counter, flipping through a magazine she clearly hadn't read. "You know," she said with a teasing grin, "I never realized how humble your life is. Must be hard, living like this." She waved her hand around the room. "I can't imagine staying here alone. Don't worry, we'll help you figure something out." She giggled at her own joke, assuming I would be embarrassed. I let her believe it amused me, though I remained perfectly composed. My calmness contrasted sharply with their agitation, though they couldn't yet see it. By then, he had arrived, the same man who had thrown divorce papers like a performance, the same man who had flaunted his imagined triumph online. He came running, suit slightly rumpled, hair messy, eyes wide. His face carried the disbelief of someone who finally recognized the scale of their miscalculation. He tried to speak, but his words stumbled over themselves, nervous, pleading. "Please, I didn't know. I didn't realize." She turned toward him, fury igniting, voice rising. "You told me she was poor. You told me she was struggling. And you..." Her words cut off as she looked back at me, eyes wide, realization dawning in painful increments. This wasn't some bluff. This wasn't luck. This was intentional, meticulous, calculated. He had lied to her, and she had fallen for it. I didn't intervene. I watched from the edge of the garden, standing straight, calm, observing every twitch, every falter, every gasp. Let them unravel. Let them feel the weight of assumptions collapsing. They had spent months constructing a narrative in which they were victorious. Now they were raw, exposed, humbled by a reality that was always there just out of sight. He dropped to his knees on the gravel, a silent, desperate gesture. He reached for her hand, pleaded, whispered apologies that had lost all meaning. He begged for forgiveness, for understanding, for some measure of reprieve from the consequences he had never anticipated. She didn't know whether to scream, cry, or storm back to the car. The reality of her complicity, the full scale of her mistake, pinned her in place. He wasn't a man of wealth or power. He was, at that moment, nothing, exposed, humbled, defeated, and I remained where I had always been, untouched, unseen, sovereign. The estate had always existed. It had never depended on their approval. It had never needed recognition. It simply was, and in its silent grandeur, it reflected me, the one they had mocked, underestimated, and discarded. The fountain sparkled in the fading light. The private road stretched onward, disappearing into the tree line. Staff moved unobtrusively, observing protocol, ensuring nothing broke the quiet order of my world. And as he continued to plead, and she finally processed the full scale of her misjudgment, I allowed myself a deep, steady breath, They had arrived thinking they would confront weakness. Instead, they confronted inevitability. And for the first time, both of them understood exactly who they had been dealing with. I met them at the mean gates, letting them step inside as though they were entering a world they had no right to. The gravel crunched under their shoes, but I didn't hurry. I wanted them to feel the weight of every step, to sense the expansiveness of a life they assumed I lacked. The air was calm, carrying the scent of earth and roses, of polished wood and distant vineyards. Each footfall echoed their audacity and their ignorance. I led them past the fountains, letting the water's quiet gurgle contrast with the chaos they had carried inside themselves for months. The girlfriend's jaw had not yet recovered. She kept blinking, as though the estate might vanish if she looked too closely. I said nothing. My silence became a lens, forcing them to absorb every detail without commentary. Marble columns, wrought iron balconies, sculpted hedges, every element a reminder that they had misjudged me entirely. He tried to speak, stumbling over a rehearsed confidence. This is impressive, he said, voice trembling, a mixture of awe and shame. I didn't realize. You didn't? I interrupted softly, letting the words hang like a sentence of their own. Not because I hid it, but because you never cared to see. You never asked. You never respected the possibility that I might have a world beyond what you were allowed to perceive. They followed me along the private road to the lake, where sunlight kissed the water, and the boathouse stood like a silent sentinel. I gestured at the rowing docks, the guest houses tucked into the trees, the vineyard rows stretching beyond the horizon. Every glance I allowed them to take was intentional, every detail a revelation. Her face, usually so self-assured, tightened with disbelief. She had imagined this life as impossible, yet here it was, undeniable, untouchable. All of this, it's yours, she asked, voice small now, stripped of the teasing arrogance she had once wielded like a weapon. Yes, I said, and my tone was quiet but unshakable. All of this has always been mine. I didn't flaunt it, because the right people don't need proof of strength. You assumed weakness, and weakness is easy to underestimate. The girlfriend's eyes flashed to him, then back to me, her voice rising in frustration. You let this happen, and he's useless. He told me she was broke. She was struggling. And look at this. Look at what you are. She was shouting now, a fire fueled by betrayal and embarrassment. He flinched, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find a script that could absolve him. I didn't know. I was confused. I want to start over. I can fix this. I can. I stopped and turned to face him fully, my gaze steady, unwavering. Every ounce of patience I had cultivated over years of humiliation, over months of silent observation, crystallized into that single moment. You really should have paid attention, I said softly. I didn't hide wealth from you. I hid myself from someone who didn't deserve me. Everything else, it's just details. He went pale, and I could see the moment he realized the depth of his misjudgment. She recoiled, disbelief etched across her features. He had imagined a life built on my ignorance, on my supposed dependence, on the illusion of fragility. Instead, he stood on the threshold of a world he couldn't touch, facing the truth he had ignored for years. I led them inside the main house, walking slowly through the galleries, letting them glimpse my family's history, the art, the letters, the objects of legacy and memory. He avoided my gaze, shrinking into himself as she critiqued him, calling him incompetent, a man who had never truly earned anything. Their roles had reversed entirely. She had been his ally, his co-conspirator, yet now she wielded the realization of his failures as a weapon. Every room we passed, every corner I revealed, was a calculated lesson in perception. They assumed I was quiet, powerless, inconsequential. I had been none of those things. My silence had been my power, and now they were witnesses to it, unable to refute or escape the truth. By the time we returned to the balcony overlooking the vineyards, the tension had shifted completely. I felt it radiating from him, a mixture of shame and helplessness. She glared at him, frustrated, bewildered, furious, while I remain the quiet center of gravity. I think you understand now, I said softly, almost gently, that underestimating someone isn't just careless, it's dangerous. And when they finally revealed themselves, you have nowhere to hide. They didn't respond. Words failed them, as they should have. They were forced to sit in the shadow of what they had mocked, of what they had tried to diminish. And in that silence, I felt the final thread of vindication tighten, not as revenge, but as clarity. I had been underestimated, yes. But now, finally, they could see exactly who I was. And in that clarity, the power was unmistakably, entirely mine. The morning was crisp, the sun casting long shadows across the driveway as I walked into the study, the final divorce papers resting on the mahogany desk. My hands were steady, my posture composed. He and his girlfriend had been allowed inside one last time, but I made it clear from the moment they entered that the tone of this meeting was mine to set. No dramatics, no outbursts, no performances, just quiet, undeniable authority. I slid the pen across the desk with deliberate calm. He leaned forward, fumbling, eyes darting between the documents and my face, as if searching for a hint of weakness. There was none. I signed first, slowly, savoring the weight of every stroke, the finality in each line. Every signature was a reminder of the years he had underestimated me. Every flourish a silent assertion of the control he had assumed I lacked. He swallowed, trying to speak, but I didn't look at him. His girlfriend shuffled behind, arms crossed, a mixture of disbelief and frustration etched across her features. They had spent months assuming I was powerless, imagining they could publicly shame me, flaunt their success, and claim victory. Now, as I completed the last page, the illusion collapsed. Outside, I could hear their voices rising. They were arguing, the sound spilling through the open windows, carrying their frustration and desperation. He pleaded, Can we work things out privately? His tone was low, almost desperate, as though the courthouse walls themselves could absorb some of the humiliation he now realized he had earned. I paused, set the pen down, and finally turned to face him. My voice was calm, deliberate, untouchable. This is private, I said, and it's over. He glanced at the envelope in his hand and tried to hand it over. I took it slowly, letting my fingers graze the folder. You really should have read what you signed, I said softly, just above a whisper. He froze, brow furrowing. The words struck harder than any shout or accusation could. She noticed his hesitation and furrowed her brow too, uncertain, as if sensing the first tremor in the narrative they had carefully built. I gestured for them to sit, offered tea again, and watched them begin to talk over each other. Each word, each boast, each carefully rehearsed compliment to one another only cemented the illusion they clung to. Meanwhile, I absorbed it all, quietly cataloging every misstep, every smug glance, every overconfident assumption. They were certain they had me cornered. They were certain I had no advantage, no leverage, no unseen strength. And yet, in their ignorance, I held all the cards. The visit ended politely. They left, believing they'd reminded me of my place, confident that they'd displayed dominance. I closed the door, leaned against it for a moment, and allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Let them celebrate their moment. They had no idea what waited for them, quietly building, patiently growing, hidden in plain sight. And I knew, with certainty, the real reckoning had only just begun. The morning of the hearing, I woke early, not from nerves, but from a strange, steady anticipation. I didn't sleep on the thought of humiliation or revenge. I slept on the thought of justice unfolding exactly as it should. When I arrived at the courthouse, the marble floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the chatter of early cases bounced off the high ceilings. He was already there, pacing near the bench, hence gesturing in exaggerated frustration, like a man rehearsing for a scene in a play that everyone else had forgotten. His girlfriend followed closely, heels clicking with each step, her laughter too sharp, too rehearsed, as though the acoustics of the room needed padding with her superiority. They were ready to perform, ready to prove to the world, and maybe to themselves, that he had won. I didn't speak. I walked beside my lawyer, calm, measured, silent. There was no need to advertise confidence. It poured from me naturally, the quiet kind that comes from knowing you hold the truth. I had rehearsed this in my head countless times, imagining every possible objection, every gasp, every moment they'd misread the room. I knew exactly what would happen, and I didn't flinch when they passed me in the hallway, smiling falsely as if my presence alone would shake me. They didn't see the fortress behind my calm demeanor, the estate, the assets, the control I had maintained quietly while he played at bravado. When the judge called the case, he practically strutted to the front. He leaned on the rail, glancing at the gallery as though seeking applause. I expect this to be straightforward, he whispered to his girlfriend, smirking. I get what I deserve. She'll have nothing to say about it. He imagined the media coverage, the whispers of acquaintances and coworkers, the social proof of his victory. He had already won in his mind. The world thought he had won, and for a few brief seconds, I let him believe it. Then my lawyer spoke. He began calmly, almost conversationally, summarizing our discussion. Your Honor, I would like to present the prenup signed by both parties prior to the marriage. Clause 17 explicitly states that in the event the husband initiates divorce proceedings, he forfeits all claims to marital assets, including any property, financial accounts, and spousal support. Martin's voice was smooth, but authoritative, the kind of voice that carries weight not through volume but precision. The room was silent. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, scanning the document. I kept my gaze neutral, hands folded in my lap. My heart didn't race. Anticipation was a different rhythm. I knew what was coming. The first ripple of shock spread across the gallery as murmurs began to rise, and I allowed myself a small, private smile. His girlfriend gasped sharp, high-pitched, almost theatrical. She had no idea this was coming. She looked at him as if the floor had dropped beneath them both. Her hands trembled slightly, phone slipping from her grasp. She had been certain he would walk away with a windfall, a bragging point to flaunt online and in the eyes of friends. Instead, she faced a reality that contradicted every narrative she had invested in. He went pale, not a normal pale and ashen, almost translucent color that left his lips tight and his eyes wide. The confident swagger vanished in an instant, replaced by disbelief. His mouth opened as though he wanted to speak, to argue, to claim some alternate interpretation. But no words came. The truth had hit him before his ego could muster a defense. The prenup was absolute. Every asset, every property, every account, every scrap of supposed control he imagined he had over me or my life was protected beyond reach. That apartment he had bragged about kicking me out of, the one he and his girlfriend imagined as a triumph. In my name, always in my name, he had assumed dominance over it, mocked my supposed helplessness, and displayed it publicly. Now he understood the magnitude of his error, the depth of his misjudgment, the sheer absence of leverage he had ever held. I noticed the tension in the courtroom shift. People who had assumed this would be a spectacle, a heated fight with dramatic declarations, realized something quietly monumental had occurred. Power had changed hands in an instant. He had spent months projecting superiority, publicly celebrating what he thought was his win. And now, the very foundation of that victory crumbled beneath him. He swallowed, dry, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. The girlfriend's eyes darted to mine, then to him, then to the document, as if trying to find a loophole in reality itself. None existed. The truth of the prenup, of my planning, of my foresight, was undeniable. Their assumptions had been built on sand, now washed away by the tide of legal clarity. The judge's gavel struck lightly but firmly, emphasizing the weight of each word. Based on the documentation presented, the judge said, the court recognizes the validity of the prenup. The petitioner forfeits all claims to marital assets as outlined. Case dismissed as to property and support. A collective hush swept the room. My husband slumped slightly, shoulders drooping in disbelief. His girlfriend's mouth opened and closed like a fish struggling for air. Neither could believe the moment, The magnitude, the reality, the theater they had rehearsed, the scripts they had written for social media and gossip, evaporated instantly. I remained seated, poised, calm, invisible to them yet omnipresent in every realization now flashing across their faces. The power reversal was complete. I was not the defeated wife. I was the architect of his public collapse. I was the quiet force he had ignored, the one underestimated, the one who had waited until the precise moment to reclaim control without raising a voice. Every plan, every asset, every subtle measure of foresight had coalesced into a singular, undeniable truth. He had nothing, nothing at all. And in that silence, filled with his disbelief and her shock, I allowed a small smile. This was only the beginning. The call came just hours after the court ruling. I didn't answer. I knew she would show up. I knew she would try to confront me, to demand some explanation, to see if she could uncover a secret, a weakness, a trace of the broke wife she had been laughing at online. And, as expected, she appeared late that afternoon, driving a car that looked suspiciously rented. Probably another display of borrowed luxury meant to intimidate. By the time she reached the gates, I was already walking the estate grounds, watching the vineyards sway in the soft breeze. The front gates were ornate, wrought iron with gold inlay, secured with a discreet keypad and a security guard who had been trained to treat these intrusions with quiet authority. The gravel road curved past fountains that glimmered under the sun, past manicured gardens, past the edge of the private lake that reflected the afternoon sky like glass. When she saw it, her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes widened, her entire posture stiffening. She was no longer laughing. She was frozen. The small vehicle she had driven seemed suddenly insignificant against the vast expanse of my family's property. The estate wasn't just large, it was a world she couldn't have imagined existed. Villas tucked behind trees, guest houses she assumed were storage sheds, staff moving silently in uniforms that spoke of discretion and precision. Even the gallery wing peeked through the tree line, glass glinting with quiet elegance. For the first time, she realized the woman her boyfriend had publicly trashed, the one she had mocked and ridiculed online, wasn't broken, wasn't desperate, wasn't powerless. She was me, the very definition of untouchable, of security, of silent dominance. The irony must have hit her like a physical blow. No phones were filming now, no smirks, no applause, no staged Instagram posts, just the quiet power of legacy and presence. She finally spoke, voice trembling as if she were confronting a ghost. What did you do? How? Words failed her. The sentences hung in the air, incomplete, irrelevant, meaningless in the face of the reality she now saw. Every assumption she had held that he had won, that I had nothing, that she was now elevated crumbled with a single glance at the estate gates and the immensity beyond them. His shoulders sagged. The realization hit him fully now. There would be no rewriting history, no claiming control, no extracting any remnant of leverage. Every assumption he had made, every boast, every online display of triumph, had led only to this moment, a quiet, absolute closure he could neither avoid nor undo. The staff guided them gently, but firmly toward the gates. His girlfriend glared at me one last time, sullen fury flashing in her eyes, while he followed, hesitant, his steps uncertain. Every stride they took felt like the closing of a chapter, each footfall marking the end of a story they had tried to write themselves. The iron gate swung shut behind them, a soft but final clang echoing across the estate grounds. He reached for the handle as if hoping for one more glimpse, one last chance to negotiate, to reclaim something intangible. But it was too late. My world remained serene, intact, untouchable. His face disappeared behind the bars, swallowed by the immensity of what he had lost, what he had never earned. I watched the gates swing closed, the sound resonating like a punctuation mark on the months of deception, public spectacle, and assumed victories. And as the click of the final lock echoed in the air, I exhaled, feeling the weight of freedom settle around me, calm, absolute, and unshakable. The morning after the gates closed, the estate felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had. The quiet halls, The rolling vineyards, the reflective surface of the lake no longer just held memories of my family. They held the promise of the person I was becoming. For the first time in years, I felt untethered from the expectations, manipulations, and illusions of a man who had spent so long trying to define me by his own insecurities. I realized that peace wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming the life that had always been mine. I walked through the gardens, letting the soft crunch of gravel underfoot remind me that every path I took from here would be deliberate. Every decision, every investment, every plan would be for me not to prove a point, not to answer anyone's judgment, but to honor the life I had worked quietly to build. The estate's operations were already thriving, but I began expanding them further. New vineyard plantings, art commissions, and a private retreat program that combined luxury with education. Each project reminded me that the wealth I possessed was more than material, it was autonomy, vision, and legacy. I spent time in the guest houses, ensuring each was functional and welcoming, a reflection of the care and thoughtfulness that had been absent in my marriage. I hosted staff meetings, reviewing projects and listening to ideas, realizing that leadership was not about showing off, but about nurturing potential. The estate had always been a symbol of privilege, but now it became a canvas for growth, creativity, and empowerment. Evenings were spent in the gallery wing, where sunlight cast soft patterns across generations of collected art and heirlooms. I lingered over old journals and letters, absorbing the wisdom of those who had walked these halls before me. Their voices, though long gone, reminded me that true strength was quiet, patient, and intentional. I no longer needed anyone's validation. I no longer sought approval from a man who had belittled me, nor from the woman who had tried to claim me as a rival. Social media, once a battlefield of public humiliation, became irrelevant. I didn't post updates, flaunt achievements, or invite comparisons. The world could believe what it wanted. Sometimes, the most powerful statement was silence. Let them think they had won. Let them cling to the illusion of control. The truth had already revealed itself, and it would continue to unfold in its own time. For beyond their comprehension, I reflected on how different life felt when I finally prioritized myself. Mornings were no longer punctuated by anxiety over how I might appear to someone else. Nights weren't filled with imagined judgments or endless rationalizations. I was free to invest in my passions, expand my horizons, and nurture relationships that mattered: friendships, family, and connections built on authenticity rather than performance. Sometimes, the most satisfying revenge is in confrontation or spectacle. It's subtle. It's in watching someone expend energy on an illusion while your reality flourishes. It's in living fully, boldly, and unapologetically. My former husband had assumed he could define me, humiliate me, and claim what wasn't his. He had no idea that the real power was never his to touch. As I walked along the lake at sunset, the water shimmering in gold and pink, I felt the deep, unshakable satisfaction of reclaiming my life. I had endured humiliation, betrayal, and arrogance, yet here I stood, calm, capable, and radiant. Every challenge, every slight, every public spectacle had led to this moment: clarity, autonomy, and profound empowerment. Sometimes, the best revenge is letting someone think they've won until the truth shows they never stood a chance. And in that truth, I found more than vindication. I found myself,